This research began for me about 8 years ago when I was invited to work with a group of educators to try to figure out why our results had been stagnant or declining for the last 50 years. We also started looking at the transition or the paradigm shifts taking place, and that became the book Humanizing the Education Machine. A few years later, we were still asking some of the same kinds of questions. But in this case, what we were asking is what's happening to our teachers? No one could have known the current conditions that we would be in today. When we were doing the research, what we found was a chronic condition called the caregiver's dilemma. So the questions we had led us to look deeper. What we discovered is this incredible burnout rate, that up to 50% of teachers wash out in the first 5 years. So this is what led us to these new questions and the research behind whole, and our basic premise that what teachers really need is to be taken care of, their mental health, their physical health, and if they're healthy and happy, the byproduct will be an engaged and thriving student. So in our opening chapter, we talk about the real challenge behind what looks like disengagement. And that real challenge is, again, that caregiver's dilemma. It's not that teachers intentionally disconnect. In fact, they get into teaching because they care deeply. And what they experience is this lack of support, this overwhelming need that they can't fill, but they're compelled as caregivers to try to fill the gap. So it's not that they don't care, it's that they care too much to the point where it begins to harm them and then impede or harm the education of our students. What we found is that these conditions have been getting worse over the decades, like a slow rot to our foundation. So it was chronic, but now with COVID-19, what was chronic has now become acute. And that's what this webinar is about. It's picking up on the last chapter, and here we see one of our heroes in the book. Her name is Tess. She was a math teacher in high school who burnt out and left and went on a road trip to find herself again and to explore what happened. Where did her capacity to inspire young students go? Well, she found it on the road trip, and she came back to the very same school that she left, and there she became a mentor. So what we're going to share in this particular webinar are some of the lessons she learned. I'm going to frame it in what I'm calling the 6 principles of post-traumatic growth, and I'll explain that as we get into the webinar. We've become very familiar with PTSD, or post-traumatic stress syndrome. We've learned about it primarily through soldiers who have come back from combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we found is that in 3 million tours of duty, somewhere between 11 to 20% of those soldiers came back with PTSD. That's over 450,000. This became a high area of concern and an area of research. And what they found in these thousands and thousands of soldiers coming back is that a small percentage came back stronger. And that became known as post-traumatic growth. In researching the traits that were different in these soldiers from those who came back, oftentimes debilitated for life, they found 6 key traits. I'm calling them the 6 principles for post-traumatic growth. And that's what we'll be discussing today. So as an overview, let's go through the 6 principles. And as I go through them, ask yourself which one of those is your standout number 1 strength, because that's part of the strategy of building on. We build from current capacity to new capacity. So the very first one, the foundational principle, is a positive mindset. Number 2 is playing to your strengths. Number 3 is what I call the circle of 5, the 5 key relationships in your life that provide buoyancy, balance, and hold you to your better self. Number 4 is sleep. It's really about health and wellness, but I put sleep because that is the linchpin to gaining health and wellness. Number 5 is meaning and purpose. Having a framework that sees meaning and purpose in the work you're doing. Something beyond you, something bigger than you. And number 6, daily accomplishments. A sense that you're making progress on a daily basis. So these are the 6 principles. So pause for a second and ask yourself, which one of these is your strongest one? And then as you're doing it, rank those 6 so that you have some means at the end of this webinar of beginning to develop a plan to begin building all of them, because all 6 are essential if you want to have resilience and the ability to bounce back and get stronger through hard times. Now, in my case, positive mindset is the strongest attribute for me. That's the one that everything else builds upon. In fact, I learned a few years ago when we had brain scans done of our whole family that persistence was my number one mental attribute. That's the strongest attribute that I exhibited. And my wife affectionately calls it the pit bull syndrome that I've got. So it works for me sometimes, but in other times it can work against me. However, that's part of my growth as well. Each of you will probably have a different starting point, but it's very important to identify that starting point because, again, building from things that are already strong is the easiest way to continue to grow in these areas. So let's talk about my story. When did this really take place for me? And I need to go back to 1999. At that time, I had taken a new role as the VP of Sales and Marketing for an office furniture distributor that was growing at a rapid rate. They had doubled over the last 5 years, and my hope and dream was to help them double again over 5 years and then retire. They gave me a 10-year contract. So I moved our family from the Washington, D.C. suburbs to Dallas, Texas to take over this role. I came in thinking that this would be easy for me, things I've done for decades. And now I have the opportunity to create a retirement and retire at the age of 50 or 55 very easily. And as you can see, that did not take place. So like the unsuspecting hero going into this new scenario, God had different plans for me. And this brought me to my knees. But that was part of learning these 6 principles that I'm going to teach you today. And I hope you will find the same level of resilience that I was able to learn and develop during these next several years. In November of 2000, not quite a year after arriving in Dallas, everything was going well. And then I got that phone call. One of our largest clients placed the largest order our company had ever received, more than $15 million, and I got a phone call asking, can we cancel the order? And of course, my heart began to race. I began breathing heavy, and I just bought time and said, let me check on it. I checked with the manufacturer. I knew it was very close to that product already shipping and being on the road. And to my relief, it had already shipped. And I called that client back and I said, I'm so sorry, it is already on the road. Of course, I wasn't sorry, I was relieved. But little did I know that this was the beginning of a great collapse where everything caved in on our company and on me. So between November of 2000 to March of 2001, we lost 70% of our revenue as a company. That is devastating. 70% of our revenue was tied up in telecommunications and high tech, these new internet providers that were spawning across the country. And boom, just like that, we were on our knees. And of course, everybody took significant pay cuts, including me. But then very soon, within the next few months, I came into the office and I found my email wasn't working. Now, it didn't occur to me that my email may have been shut off by the company. So I went to Walt, our IT person. I said, Walt, my email's not working. Can you help me here? He simply said, you need to go talk to the owner. So I went in and talked to the owner, and I found the owner very pensive and stressed. Now, there is a little backstory I need to let you know about. I met this owner in 1978 when I was a brand new project manager in architecture and construction for Southwestern Bell. And he was my vendor or supplier. We became very close friends. And I helped him buy into this distributor a few decades ago. So I'm in his office, I take a seat, and he is almost angry. And he says, Rex, we don't need a VP of sales. We need sales. I'm prepared to say goodbye to you today. And in that, he ripped up my 10-year contract. Or you can go back into sales. Now, I felt like the Lord had brought our family to Texas. We had been in Texas prior to us having kids, and we had been part of a church plant. So now I'm coming back to Texas and reestablishing relationships and also working in advisory role from some paraministries. As he was sharing this news, expecting me to get up and walk out and leave, I simply said, I don't know why this is happening, but I know I'm here for a purpose, and I made a 10-year commitment to you, which I plan to keep. Regardless of whether or not the contract still stands, I will remain and I will go back in sales. So you can imagine that Friday afternoon was a heavy evening for our family. None of us really knew the implications of this. All I knew is that Monday I would arrive, I would be part of the sales meeting, but this time I would be simply a salesperson. And the person that I brought in from the warehouse into sales would now be my boss. It was probably easier for me to do this because I knew there was a purpose behind it than those I had been the boss for previously, but that was the way it was. So over the next 5 years, I had to literally reinvent myself, find ways to dig out. At one point, I was at $150,000 in credit card debt. I went from a nice six-figure income to 30,000 draw. What 30,000 draw means is I have to pay that back. It's just a loan until I can pay it back. So needless to say, I was upside down and underwater and getting further underwater or in debt every single month. Now, God miraculously met our needs. And over the next 5 years, I not only was able to rebuild as a salesperson and do extremely well, but I also wrote my first book during that time for an organization called Leadership Network, a Christian organization that provides platforms for individuals that have unique perspectives on leadership for church leaders. During that time of reinvention, of becoming very humbled and having to rely on people and friends, and going back to the things that I naturally do well, which we'll talk about, I was able to come back. And when I left the company, I was the largest producer. Over 49% of the revenue for this large company were my accounts. And so I left on a very good note. And I felt that was part of God's way of helping redeem not only my finances, but my reputation, and giving me the confidence to be able to leave and having fulfilled my obligation to this company. Now let's fast forward to this year. In the first few weeks of March, our family was down in Padre Island in South Texas, enjoying spring break. I heard a little bit of news about this thing called COVID-19 and thought, okay, this will blow over. Many of us thought the same thing. When we got back to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, I started getting cancellations from clients. All of my business, 95% of my business, is based on getting on a plane, traveling, delivering a workshop, consulting, or doing keynote presentations. All of that was gone. Between March 15 and the first few weeks of April, 95% of my revenue for the entire year disappeared. However, something was very different. And the difference was what was inside of me. I had been working on these 6 principles for the last 20 years. These were second nature to me. I knew exactly what it would require of me, and I moved into that gear. And the adage, never let a crisis go to waste, I didn't let it go to waste. I looked at new opportunities, and those new opportunities were that I was going to be home all the time. So it helped me with my family. It helped me with my physical health. And because I wasn't on the road, I was recapturing about 2 days of unproductive time that I put to good use in reinventing myself. What you're looking at now, this studio, was part of that reinvention. I would not have been able to do that had I not been diligent in building on these 6 principles. So what I'm telling you is that what I'm about to share is not theory, it's practice. So let's fast forward this, not only the research that we did, but also the 6 principles. Now, Whole came out in March 15 of this year. There are a few times when a book comes out that's current, that's happening right now. And as you read Whole, you'll find that a lot of the work and the research is about helping us with our mental health, helping build resilience, helping build social and emotional skills in our kids and in ourselves. It's such a timely book. And COVID-19 has now taken a lingering problem and made it an acute problem for today. So I'd like to review where we are as a nation and where we are individually. So let's look at what's happened here. I began doing work on burnout and trauma with Dr. Jernigan during the research for Whole. And as I went back to him, as some of my clients were having some challenges with employees, and asked him to help me understand what is it that we're likely to experience through this, he said, Rex, this is a mass disaster. Now, his organization specializes in mass disaster recovery. They're a Christian psychological firm out of Southern California. They've worked in 4 major war zones in Africa, dealing with PTSD and trauma. What he said is a mass disaster has these stages that we all go through. These are psychological stages. And the first stage, of course, is the apprehension. It's the warning. If you've ever lived in areas that have hurricanes or tornadoes, you know that there is a warning sign. There's a watch and then there's a warning. And there's always some apprehension, a bit of nervousness and uncertainty. And then it hits. Now, fortunately, most of the time, we're not affected by it in a major way. But when you do get hit, it is traumatic. Whether it's the house that comes down, the neighborhood thrown apart, electricity and water not being available, this is crisis mode. And in this crisis mode, it then goes into another stage. So we go from impact into what's called a heroic stage. And the heroic stage is when everybody kind of rises to the occasion. It's when we are our best selves, but we're running on adrenaline. In most mass disasters, this period lasts sometimes only a few hours to maybe a few weeks. But we've been in this zone for months now, and it's wearing us down. I am coaching more than 60 individuals. I'm seeing the toll that sheltering in place and trying to work from home is having on people. We're not designed to be isolated like this. We're not designed to be on top of each other 24/7. And even though we can go through this for a short amount of time, it's not sustainable. In the corporate world, I had several companies coming back in the initial phases, seeing higher than expected productivity with people working from home. But that was a false positive. That was because they were in this heroic phase. Some were working more hours because of fear. Some were working more hours because of adrenaline. The bottom line is that we didn't have enough time to see the long-term effects of working or learning in this mode. As school has begun again, I've had coaching clients having a child on their lap during the time. I've had coaching clients, when I look in their face, I can tell they're not having a great day. And then I'll ask them, I said, how is your day going? And there is a big release. And I hear how challenging it is to try to work and keep a child occupied and have your spouse in the same house and not have enough room or spread out and work together, or not having strong internet connections and having to call back or call on the phone and not use Zoom. All of these complications, and it's compounded for families that live in lower income neighborhoods. It is a mess. It is a disaster. And very few schools have been able to figure out how to do this hybrid learning smoothly and effectively. Look at what's happening to the universities opening up with all the best of intentions to get back to school. But now with the outbreak, so many universities are having to shut things down, and then the ripple effect on the housing and the students that can't go home. Again, we're in a mess. This is what's called a mass disaster. We're all in this, and there's psychological stages we go through. The next stage is called the honeymoon stage. And the honeymoon stage is when there's some stability. And what we've seen is that the federal government, with the stimulus package, has stabilized things for a little bit. And during the summer, a lot of schools and a lot of companies thought, now that we've stabilized, we can begin to look down the road to the fall and bringing employees back to work or bringing students back in. Now we're set up for the next stage, which is the stage we're entering into now, and it's called the disillusionment stage. This is when we lose complete trust in our authorities, in our institutions, because of setbacks. And we're seeing setbacks in so many ways. We're seeing social unrest in the cities. We're seeing setbacks in the plans that schools have made. You may have been planning to teach in classrooms, and now you've got to go back to hybrid. These setbacks are demoralizing. And so when you're physically and emotionally drained to begin with, and you have some hopes, and then you have setbacks, we go into, again, this disillusionment stage. Once we can get to the true bottom and reconcile ourselves with the true bottom, that's when we can begin to rebuild and start moving into the reconstruction phase. But the expectation in the reconstruction phase has to be things are never going to go back to the way they are. We have to build something new. I think it's important to understand these phases and understand where people may be in these. and certainly not trying to minimize or downplay the real pain, the emotional pain and the grief that everybody is in, and recognizing that grief is simply loss. It's the loss of what we're familiar with. It's the loss of contact with people we love. It's the loss of a sense of progress. All of those are loss, and we have to address them. We can't gloss over them, and that's my big concern. I'm seeing too many organizations simply glossing over these and not recognizing that we're going to be in this mode for a considerable amount of time, and there will be trigger events. Annual events or trigger events that take you emotionally back to that same dark place that we have all been in. So when I work with Dr. Jernigan and I work with my corporate clients, the big aha, the paradigm shift for many of them is they had been thinking that this was simply an event that we'll get through and then we'll move back into a more normalized stage. But what Dr. Jernigan has helped me understand and what I've helped my clients understand is this is going to be a process. It can be a process of years and maybe a decade before we get fully emotionally back to the way we were. And he used 9/11 as an example. He said it took New York City almost a decade so that people felt emotionally healthy and were immune to the triggers that once brought them back to these dark places. So now that we've talked about where we are as a collective, and it's very important that you take some time and look at that and really evaluate it and take it for what it is. Don't try to gloss over. Now we have to ask, where are you in this process? And all of us will go through some stages of Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. Grief is how we deal with loss. So in the initial stages of this, many of us were in denial. We'll get through this. We'll go back to normal. I still have clients that are in some degree in this denial phase thinking, we will get through this. We've been through recessions before and it'll get back to normal. I am telling you, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event that changes everything. Learning will never be the same again for good reasons. And it gives us the opportunity to let go of some of the constraints that were holding us back and holding performance. This old paradigm that I call Gutenberg learning model, which we wrote about in Humanizing the Education Machine. That statue of learning that we honored and respected for close to 500 years has been toppled. And now we're in this new distributed form of learning that we need to learn what the wineskin looks like to be able to optimize that, or we will continue to fall behind in our learning and our education standards. The next stage was anger. Now, I experienced that as I started to see clients canceling. And even though I didn't express my anger directly to them, I certainly vacillated between anger and bargaining by trying to see, hey, if we just delay the event a little bit, if I reduce my cost a little bit. It was discouraging and I was in that anger mode. However, having been through this and having those 6 principles in place, I was able to cycle through these very rapidly and get to that other side. And so once you go through the anger and the bargaining, trying to modify or buffer the impact, and a lot of schools have been doing that bargaining, doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, hoping in the end that we can buy time to get us through this. It's only when you get the setbacks and say, all of our best plans to try to modify the hit that we've experienced aren't working. We have to start from the very bottom and rebuild again. That's when we get to what's called the new adventure. In literature, when the hero goes through this trials and tribulation, they get to what's called this dark night of the soul. And that's where education is right now, because what they were hoping to avoid in the fall has hit them. But it's only after that dark night of the soul that we come out ready for the new adventure, a new person. We become born again, having given up everything we're trying to hold on to, that the new reality is trying to get us to let go of. We now have to reinvent. That's where we are today. Now, I recommend that you pause and you really consider, where are you in these 5 stages? And please recognize that you will vacillate back and forth. I have vacillated back and forth between the bargaining, to new hope, to a little bit of despair. I quickly let go of the business model that I had, which was getting on a plane and delivering my services in person, and made the assumption, what if that never comes back, and started from scratch. Part of what gets you in the right mindset is doing the what if this doesn't come back, then what would we do? If you are able to have that kind of conversation, then you're ready for the new adventure. But also, once you determine where you've been in this process, I want to ask you, have you shared where you're at? Have you shared your doubts? Have you shared your fears and uncertainties with anybody? If you have not, then you haven't fully embraced the condition and you may still be in that denial mode, thinking that you're tough enough to get through this on your own. One of the things I learned back in 2000 when I was on my knees and had no idea how I was going to rebuild my life, rebuild our finances, protect my family, I had friends. I had friends I could open up to. I had friends who could pick me up. I had friends who could speak truth to me. And that's what we need. And that's what we all need during this time so that we can be our best selves, not only to our students, but to our families. So part of figuring out where you're at is make an inventory of what you've lost. Make an inventory of loss. I've lost contact with this friend. I don't know what's happening to these students that I care about. I don't feel comfortable in this new world of online learning. And now I feel I've lost that competency because of this new environment. Make a list of all that inventory and then begin addressing that direct loss and indirect loss and find out where you're at in those 5 stages. One of the things I've been discovering here is a whole Christian tradition around lament. I need to thank my good friend, Pastor Mark Vrogo, who is the senior pastor for College Park Church in Indianapolis. He wrote a book called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercies. I've been going through that book looking at the model that God has given us to be able to express our grief and our complaint and go to the Lord and find healing and redemption in this wonderful vehicle that He provided called lament. You may not be aware, but 49 of the Psalms are lament Psalms. Then we have the book of Jeremiah, and we have Job, and we have Paul talking about the trials and tribulations. And there is a process here, and first of all, that we can come to the Lord. So I'm using Psalm 77, which is in the framework of the book that Pastor Vrogo provided, and it's a roadmap for lament. The first thing that I found very comforting is that I can come to the Lord and express my complaint. David says, I cried out to the Lord. In verse 7, he lays out the complaint. Are you going to reject us forever? Because that's what it felt like. It felt so devastating what he was going through that he felt like, the Lord has just given up on us. And he felt comfortable saying, I don't like it, Lord. Are you going to give up on us forever? And then the next step in the process is making the appeal. Lord, come back and revisit us like you did in times of old, or like you did last year with our classroom, or like you did in our family a couple years ago. Please, I appeal to you, come back. Now, as you're going through these stages of expressing your complaint, expressing your hope, there is a turn. And it is a turn to remember the goodness of the Lord, where He saved His people, where He saved you, and remembering His character, that His character is always love and always has your best in mind. And so this process is part of the healing, and it's something that Christians have that the world does not have access to, is the ability to come through these hard times and to express our laments and find healing and strength and renewed hope. Now I'm going to take a pivot. So we've talked about where we're at in terms of the stages of a mass disaster. We've talked about where we're at as far as my personal journey through coping with loss. And we know that as Christians, we have a means of coming to the Lord, finding a level of healing and hope that the world just doesn't have. Now I'm going to shift gears, and we're going to talk about some more practical things. That's called stress. So what I'd like you to look at this list. These are many of the things that I've heard from the clients that I'm coaching that they're experiencing and feeling. They're feeling lonely, and they're feeling disconnected, and they're feeling like they don't have a good window as to what the future is going to look like. They're not sure if their activities are truly productive. I've heard expressions of the stress of having everybody in a 1-bedroom apartment trying to work together. My daughter and her husband, he has to work in the bedroom with a laptop on the bed. They have 3 dogs in a 1-bedroom apartment, and it is hard and it's stressful to work in those conditions. Many teachers and people at work are feeling like I'm not getting enough direction, or I'm not getting the kind of support that I need from my boss in order to feel like I'm being effective or even feel cared for. And then I all think we're feeling some form of Zoom fatigue. So pause for a minute and ask yourself, which of these are you experiencing? Or if you're experiencing other kinds of stress, write it down. This is part of dealing with it. This is part of the journey of identifying and getting closure, naming these things and knowing that they're there and being able to address them. And if you've got some areas that aren't covered on this list, please send them to us. We want to fully understand the kinds of things that are stressing out teachers and parents of students. Many of you as teachers also have children in school as well. Okay, we're ready to begin to go through the 6 principles for post-traumatic growth. Let's begin with the first one, positive mindset. Now I'm going to refer to Dr. Martin Seligman. He is the father of positive psychology, and it has a very profound history, and we'll go into a little bit of that history. And here Dr. Seligman is talking about that a positive mindset is essential for success because part of success is persistence. Dr. Seligman was the psychologist who did the research on the soldiers coming back with PTSD, discovering that a certain percentage were stronger. This became post-traumatic growth. Positive mindset is not thinking that circumstances will somehow magically get better if I just think they'll get better, or that my circumstances will improve if I think they will, or even that my health will improve if I simply claim that they're going to get better. Positive mindset is more like the thinking in the Lament, that there's something inside of me that will become better. When we quote the scripture, all things work for good for those who love the Lord, the Greek word for good is moral good. It's not that things simply work out for the better. It means that they work out for my good, my depth, my character. That strengthening of my faith is the same kind of reference Paul makes, that when trials make us stronger, build our character, and build our faith. That's what positive mindset means in this context. So I'm going to read a passage in Romans, so I'm going to take my eyes off the camera so I can read the text. It's Romans 5, verses 3 to 5. And Paul says, "But we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us." Can you see the similarity between Dr. Seligman's quote and Romans? It's the same kind of mindset. So prior to Dr. Martin Seligman, Dr. Donald Clifton developed strengths psychology. This is a field I've been working and consulting in for the last 18 years. And interestingly enough, Dr. Martin Seligman is a protege of Dr. Clifton. Dr. Seligman is considered the father of positive psychology. Dr. Donald Clifton is a forerunner of positive psychology. He developed a field called strength psychology. We'll talk about that in a little bit. You may know him better through the lens of the Clifton Strengths or the Strengths Finder assessment. And again, that's the tool we've been using since 2002. The radical shift in psychology, in learning, and in management that he brought in the early 60s is that we needed to shift our paradigm from working on trying to fix broken things or make our weaknesses strong. We found that our brains are wired to excel by playing to our strengths, that the happiest and most successful people consistently play to their strengths. And there's good reason for that. It's brain wiring. The strengths that are identified in the assessment really relate to these synaptic clusters, these dense areas of neurons that come together, become our most instinctive, natural ways of thinking and acting. In other words, they represent what we naturally do best and enjoy most. And so when you reinforce them, when you learn, you naturally learn faster and easier. When you do things, they are naturally better. So you have this intrinsic motivation that comes with it. In fact, there's chemical release of dopamine when you're operating in your strengths. So here's the science behind why it's more effective to consistently play to your strengths than trying to fix a weakness. A weakness is simply an area in your brain that's not highly developed, that's not dense in terms of synaptic clusters. So when you work on it or reinforce it, you stimulate it for a short period of time. It may elevate, but there's nothing to hold it together, not like a strength where you have these reinforcing clusters like a web so that the development of one strength is reinforced by the others. So it doesn't get reinforced, so therefore after you stop stimulating it, it'll drop down again. So it's very important to know that there's a reason we play to our strengths. The happiest and most successful people, I hate to tell you, are not well-rounded. They play to their strengths. But part of the training is we don't overlook the weaknesses. We build the awareness around it, but what we found is that in most cases, by playing to our strengths, we make those weaknesses irrelevant. So now we've talked about the first two principles, the positive mindset and playing to your strengths. And I want to give you a personal example here. So here you see a picture of me in a workshop. And behind me you see several individuals' profiles of their top 5 strengths. And in this image you can see my top 5 strengths. The reason it's important to point this out is that my strategy, because of my unique mix of strengths, will be different than your strategy in terms of resiliency through this particular period of COVID. There's not a one strategy fits all. There are 33,600,000 different combinations of someone's top 5 strengths in the Clifton Strengths. So we have to understand that what works for me may not work for you, and that's very important. My resiliency is my number one trait, and you see that in my strategic and achiever strengths. That is clarity about a goal in front of me, and the achiever strength that I have is that persistence that I have to stick with something until it is accomplished. But again, your strengths will be different, so your strategy will be different than mine. It's very important to recognize that. So when you play to your strengths, you're releasing dopamine and endorphins into your system. That's part of the key of building this post-traumatic growth, is being able to play to your strengths so you have this rejuvenating energy as you're even going through difficult times. Working together collectively, in other words, a barn-raising kind of approach, has been innate for me for over 30 years. It's part of my success. That now brings us to number 3, which is your circle of 5. Part of the resilience or the growth they found in soldiers that came back from the war having experienced trauma is that they had a tight network of relationships. I call it the circle of 5. So I want to ask you, who could you call at 2 a.m. and would pick up the phone and would be there? Who would hold you to your best self and be comfortable speaking truth to you, even if you don't want to hear it? And Gallup has pointed out that we need a close colleague, a friend at work, if we want to be able to get through the ups and downs at work. In fact, a person who does not have a close colleague or friend at work, somebody they're very comfortable with, is 60% more likely to leave that place of employment than those who do have that relationship. I'm going to now shift gears to a very important part, one that I neglected during the early 2000s, and that was physical health. I did not physically take care of myself during those stressful periods of time. We know exercise helps reduce stress. Also, sleep is so vitally important. And so you'll see in some of my other webinars where I actually focus on the sleep equation. We have a whole chapter in the book on sleep. We have a whole chapter in the book on physical exercise. These are so vitally important, and oftentimes these are the areas that we compromise. We don't get good sleep. We turn to unhealthy coping behaviors to manage stress, such as comfort food, or becoming sedentary and sitting or watching television, or during these times turning to medication to help us sleep or help us reduce anxiety. These are all unhealthy coping behaviors that really impede your sleep, impede your recovery, and put you on a vicious cycle of being depleted each day and getting more depleted as you go on. So part of the inventory and the question is, so how many hours of sleep do you actually get a night? If you're getting less than 7 hours a night, you are sleep deprived, and you're part of 70% of our nation who is sleep deprived. How consistent are you with sleep? It's not just enough sleep, but consistency, because your body gets into a certain rhythm. It takes a little bit of time to figure out what that optimum rhythm is. My optimal go to bed time is somewhere between 8:45 and 9:30. At least that's what the devices like the Whoop or the Oura Ring tell me in terms of feedback of when my optimal window of going to bed is. And again, the research for that is in our book. We have a chapter called Waking the Dead. It gets into the challenge of sleep in education and what it's doing to our kids in terms of their ability to perform. I firmly believe that if an entire school got a week's worth of consistent sleep, it would truly transform them, and they would never go back to the old habits they had before. One of the areas that the soldiers had with post-traumatic growth is that they had meaning in their life. There was something bigger than them that they were living for, something beyond them. A lot of this research comes from a psychologist by the name of Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a prisoner of war in Auschwitz, and he was very observant about those who survived and those who died. And to summarize it, essentially what he found is that those who did not survive had more of the kind of optimistic thinking that we see in self-help books, that the world will somehow get better if I just think it's going to get better. And those who survived found meaning because they were living for something either beyond them or bigger than them. And so every day they were able to have context for putting their experience into a form of meaning. The underlying premise of Viktor Frankl's observations is that if you believe the world has purpose and you believe that you have free will, then you have agency, or in other words, you can make the choice to interpret your circumstances in light of that purpose. And therefore, the third element is to be able to make a difference in the world around you. So when we look at the circumstances we're now in and our inability to change COVID, or change the circumstances of the recession, or change whether or not our schools will be hybrid, we can't change those. So one of the questions in exercising free will is looking at this current context and asking, what am I living for that is bigger than me in these circumstances? What am I living for or working towards that is beyond me in these circumstances? This is a vital element in the 6 principles to build growth, is that ability to find meaning and purpose in the situation that we're currently in. The final principle in developing post-traumatic growth is a sense of accomplishment, daily accomplishment. And this, interestingly enough, goes back to mindset. Are you looking for areas of progress? Or what are you measuring progress by? So when we're in these kinds of situations, what we used to measure is no longer a measure of success or progress. So we have to look for different metrics of success, different metrics for progress. So in these new conditions, some areas of progress for me are building and deepening my family relationships because I'm with them, learning new things and becoming competent in new skills. That's an area of progress that I'm measuring. The time and the opportunity I have to take more time in reflection and prayer. The opportunity I have to do regular exercise and take care of my body. The opportunity that I have to eat a home-cooked meal every night. The opportunity I have to hug my son and tell him that I love him each day. I didn't have those same opportunities before. I had different opportunities and different pressures and things driving me towards success. Now, reframing and looking at the new circumstances and the opportunities in those new circumstances, I've got a new way to measure and feel a sense of accomplishment every day. So the rest of my story is 20 years ago when I was 45 years old. I was on my knees financially. My family was really under stress because I was under stress. Now, fast forward 20 years later, I'm in a much better place physically. I was 190 pounds in 2000. Today, I'm 154. I'm in the best physical health. I have more quality time with my family. My business has come back, and I will probably do as well or better this year than I did last year. I've got a new business model that I never imagined I'd have. I've had more opportunities to reach out to friends because I'm not traveling and talk and catch up to them. So in so many ways, I am in a better place than I was 20 years ago. And I'm in a better place than I was in March when all of this went away. I went through 60 days of just panic and turmoil and trying to figure out what happens. But I have been practicing the principles of post-traumatic growth for 20 years. So I reached out to my circle of 5. I had a positive mindset, knowing that there were opportunities that if I looked for them, I could find them and reinvent myself through it. Being home has allowed me to improve my health, more consistent sleep, better diet, daily exercise. All of these things work together to help you become resilient. So back in 2000, I only knew to leverage a couple of these. And one was my persistence, or that positive mindset, and the other was my circle of 5. I discovered the strengths and how to play to your strengths in 2002, and I've been working on that ever since. And I think age, the passage of years, trials and tribulations has helped me recalibrate what meaning is, what the meaning of my life is in this current time. So, what is going to be the rest of your story? Teaching is a habitat for heroes, and this has been a heroic time, but has also been a stressful and draining time. Let's pause again and take inventory of these top 6. Which one of these 6 is your strongest one at this point, the one that you can build on? And which one are you going to start working on first? In fact, which one are you going to begin working on today? The 2 years of research we did for the book Whole, and the more than 100 educators and subject matter experts that we invited to participate and help us create this book, is more timely than ever during this COVID pandemic period that we're in. This webinar picks up from the story of Tess in chapter 19 on how she built her resilience. We're continuing to work in this space and work on helping companies and teachers build this resiliency that we're going to need now, but also we're going to have to make this our lifestyle and build this into our students, this sense of resiliency, not only the ability to bounce back, but to come back stronger. That should be our goal. In August, our company released this workbook for the workplace, and I'm going to provide members of ACSI a free digital copy of this. It's normally $149. If you use the promotion code ACSI and go to our website and order it in the products section, you will be able to download this for free. It's close to 90 pages that walks through a lot of the presentation that I gave you today. Now, it's geared towards corporate clients and it's geared toward bringing people back to work, but you'll find a lot of value and benefit in it. If there's anything we can do to help you, you can reach me at www.rexmiller.com. We're here to help you. We really believe in what you're doing. I appreciate the sacrifices that you've made. God loves you and wants you to be resilient, and bring that resiliency to your schools, to your students, who will then go out and influence their families and affect their communities. Thank you very much for this time. Take care.